Hello and welcome to our session, Listen, Learn, and Rebuild with Resilience. We're so excited to be joining you virtually today as part of Exponent Philanthropy's 2021 annual conference. My name is Elsie Thompson and I'm a Client Success Manager with Foundant Technologies. Before we jump into today's topic, I'd like to provide a little background on Foundant. Our mission is to maximize the impact of the philanthropic community. As our communities are facing increasing needs, our mission is more important to us than ever. I hope each of you finds something in the session today to help better fulfill your own missions in some way. Foundant was founded in Bozeman, Montana. Our client base, which is continuing to grow, is made up of grant makers, community foundations, scholarship providers, and nonprofits. Today, we have over 3,100 clients spread across the United States and Canada. After this webinar, we invite you to continue this conversation in our online community Compass. Visit community.foundant.com to get started and ask questions of your peers. Now on to our session. In today's session, I'll guide you through presentations from 3 experts sharing their experience and perspectives in working to better serve the philanthropic community. First up, Kari Onnested, the Director of Advancement at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits and Co-Director of Grant Advisor, will share her experience in co-spearheading the campaign to #FixTheForm. Kari is uniquely positioned to champion this initiative with her varied experience in the nonprofit sector through strategic visioning, fundraising, relationship development, sector research, and education. After Kari, we'll hear from Foundant's own Sammy Holsworth, our product manager for our grants and scholarship software. Sammy will share what some of this work can look like when using your technology stack as an enabler. Sammy brings more than 10 years of experience with Foundant Solutions and enjoys her continued relationship with Exponent Philanthropy after serving as a Next Gen Fellow in 2016. Last but certainly not least, you'll hear about the work in action from Foundant client and friend Tracy Johnson. Tracy serves as a program officer for Poise Foundation in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. At Poise, Tracy assists Black-led, Black-serving organizations in bringing change to their communities. She accomplishes this by managing the foundation's grant-making portfolio, leading strategic initiatives, developing new grant-making strategies, and engaging community stakeholders. Let's jump in and listen as Kari tells us a bit about Grant Advisor and the Fix the Form initiative.
My name is Kari Onnested. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm just thrilled to be joining you all virtually from Minnesota today. So for some context setting, you may or may not have heard of the Fix the Form initiative. Before I even jump into that, I'm going to take an even bigger step back and tell you about grantadvisor.org. This is really kind of the genesis of this bigger movement that's happening right now. So grantadvisor.org is an anonymous review site of grant-making foundations that was developed and launched by 3 nonprofit organizations about 4 years ago. I currently serve as co-director of this work, and it's really exciting. So we thought at the time, let's best take the lessons from the business industry. We've seen what Yelp and TripAdvisor can do in terms of transforming services that are provided, and we'll take those lessons and apply them to philanthropy. So thus was born Grant Advisor. So on the screen now, you can see just a snapshot of our homepage where we can collect information on different grant-making foundations, both as a feedback tool for funders, but then also it's a really important prospect research tool for grant seekers. On the next slide, you'll get to see what I'm talking about a little bit better. So in addition to in addition to the kind of aggregate feedback that we collect, we also have individual profiles. So this is a snapshot of the McKnight Foundation's profile. And this gives you a sense of the type of questions that we ask in the survey. So we ask folks to rank funders based on their overall relationship that they have, the accessibility of the funder, how successfully we think the foundation is achieving their own philanthropic goals, and then of importance, that how long did the grant application process take? As a grant seeker, it's really important for us to know as we're building out our work plans. What's not shown here are some of the qualitative questions that are built into our survey. So we ask, imagine your friend is thinking about approaching the McKnight Foundation and they want to know what advice you would have. What would you say? So over time, the 4 years that the project has been live, we have been reading closely the answers to those qualitative questions. And with 2,500 reviews now that have been written on 800 grant-making foundations in 49 of the 50 states, we're beginning to see some key themes emerge. So we've started to notice, when this project was first launched, there was some concern that, oh no, this might become the worst part of the internet. Anonymous review site, we're going to be trolled all the time and all the worst things are going to be said. Well, we have been thrilled to discover that for the most part, people have used this platform to offer positive feedback. So lifting up exemplars, saying we wish more funders did it this way. And also when there is constructive feedback, that it is that there are constructive ideas for change. On the topic of those constructive ideas, what surprised us were to see that it's actually the grant making processes. So not about who's serving on a board or who's employed as a staff member or what necessarily are even the focus areas of the foundation's grant making, but it's these processes and technologies that support the grant making process that hold the biggest promise of opportunity for the field. We also notice themes around, it's really these small little pain points that end up having this huge impact. So word and character limits, we'll talk more about what those pain points are, but it just gives you a little bit of a flavor that we were seeing a theme, that it's these, if only the funders knew that it was really these specific things and we could make these changes together, it would be transformative for the field. And then a theme kind of revealed and heightened in this past year was that those who are most impacted by systems often have really creative ideas for solutions. So thinking about grant seekers as a primary user of grants management technology and finding ways to elevate their experience just as much as the primary client, which is the foundation. So on the next slide, you can see a little bit of context setting. So it got us paying a closer attention to the technology specifically that supports grant making. On the left side, you see a picture of a hip that's been supported by a 3D printer that's been able to produce a part of a hip. On the right, you see, for any of you who are fans of Office Space, 3 disgruntled employees taking out a printer to a field. So this is just lifting up the theme that of Melvin Kranzberg's first law of technology. Technology in and of itself, it's neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral, right? So it holds great promise. It's partly about how you design it, and it's also about how it gets used. So we started paying a little bit closer attention to the technology that supports grant making and grant seeking. And we started to see that it's actually this really complicated sometimes process that evolves, right? So on your screen is a picture of a Rube Goldberg machine. So these are these really complicated, sometimes fun, almost obstacle courses in a way that can kind of, in its complicated design, in some ways predetermine what the outcome is going to be. So for grant seekers, often the work that we do is having to navigate a Rube Goldberg machine. So in order to apply to a certain foundation who requires that applications be submitted via an online portal, I have to have a working computer. So the bowling ball kind of knocks down and hits the pin. I have to have access to high-speed bandwidth internet. I have to be able to create a form, remember my password, be able to access it after the fact, right? So you can just start to see that all these little knock-on effects end up creating almost an eligibility screen on top of the eligibility requirements that foundations put around who's can access their grant dollars. So processes like technology, they're not good, they're not bad, they're not neutral. And if you want to be paying attention to what the outcomes are of a thing, you have to look at the process that's been behind it to support that. So we started looking at processes. What are the outcomes of these types of processes? So this is a snapshot from some recent research that was just released by Candid on the state of grant making. So where are grant dollars going? You can start to see that quite clearly certain nonprofit organizations serving women and girls, specific ethnic or racial groups, or people with disabilities are getting a smaller share of the grant dollar pie. And this finding is echoed in studies, certainly not a new finding, unfortunately. And there's been research on this for the past 10 or 20 years. So grant making process, technology requirements, all potentially being the key for greater accessibility or potentially an obstacle for key groups in accessing grant funding. So we really honed in on some specific process issues that we were hoping to tackle. One was, as you just saw on that chart, inequitable access to and distribution of grant funding. We were seeing that there was this incomplete feedback loop, right? Nonprofits were having these experiences with grant making processes, but because of a power differential, weren't able to kind of give that feedback back to the funder. And so these small but painful and big impactful things were continuing to happen and perpetuate if only we could just talk to each other and kind of close the gap. And then the biggest surprise of all, I think, was this emerged in the reviews on Grant Advisor, and then later in our Fix the Form survey, that 20 to 30% of a nonprofit's time is lost on technical time wasters. So having to manually enter board members' first names and last names, organizational affiliations in individual fields, translating budgets into funder templates or fields on a screen within a form. So these activities that don't necessarily relate to case development or helping a funder necessarily better understand the core of the request, but are really technical navigations of a form. 20 to 30%. We're talking thousands of hours in the aggregate that could have otherwise been invested in mission advancing activities. So thus was born Fix the Form. We knew that there were specific pain points and we just needed to identify, okay, what are the worst ones? And then how can we be a part of closing this feedback loop? My dear friend and colleague, Laura Solomons, who is both a fundraiser and a grant maker based in London, and I got together one night and we pulled together a scrappy Google document or Google form and said, this is our moment. We want to be able to hear from the grant seeking community and really aggregate and amplify this voice and offer it back to the funders. So we took some of the top pain points that were identified in Grant Advisor reviews and asked people to rank them. In less than 4 weeks, we received 500 responses from people in 9 different countries. So you can see the form had both quantitative and qualitative section. This is a snapshot of the quantitative part. So we took 16 common pain points, word or character limits, unclear eligibility requirements, requiring information that's already publicly accessible. And then we created a kind of playful pain scale or Likert scale and asked folks to say, pick your top 3, and for those top 3, rank them on the degree of pain that they cause you. We also asked a couple of narrative questions. One was, what's the impact that this has on your life and work? What advice or feedback would you give to a funder if you could, or funders in general? And then an open-ended question of anything else. So we launched this survey November of 2020. We were hoping for 200 responses. We got 500, and some great themes came out from that survey. You can see, for one, equity was named by a number of people, saying that these aren't just annoying practices, that actually for organizations, and they name particularly for Black or Brown led, that tend to be far more chronically underfunded, these practices are actually harmful. We saw effectiveness named, that by spending the time to have to navigate some of these technical things, that it's actually less for mission advancing activities. And then efficiency, right? We really are talking about hundreds or thousands of hours of people's time in life. So those were the themes. What were the top pain points? I'm sure this is what you're all dying to know. So they said, not being able to see the full application ahead of time, i.e. surprise questions. That was the number one. The time taken to apply being disproportionate to funding awarded. That's a little less clear, it's a little squishy. And then the forms that can't be saved or returned to. What's interesting about these top 3 is that from the moment the first person filled out the survey to the 500th person, these were the top 3. They never changed. They got the most number of votes and they were rated the highest degree of pain. So there is strong and clear consensus from the field that these are the things that we need to be addressing. So on the next slide, you get to see the full, I won't go into detail on the full ratings of pain points, but you can see that folks, the concentration of the pain and that by the degree of darkness of the red on that right side, or those 3. So we can't address all of these all at once, right? We have to start somewhere. So we decided to really focus on that top concern, not being able to see the full application ahead of time. It is specific. There are some solutions that are pretty easily implemented. And if we could start, right, nudge theory, start with that, the easy to address one, we can then move to the next one. This is the number one pain point of 500 grant seekers. Hopefully it's a small ask that would have a big impact, and it's one step on a bigger journey.
I was surprised to hear from Kari that even before launching Fix the Form, the folks at Grant Advisor noticed a large trend in feedback from grant seekers around grant-making processes and technologies. Organizations spend time being thoughtful about their goals and funding objectives, and I don't think it's as common for operations and the systems we use to work towards these goals to get as much attention. With the COVID-19 pandemic, we have been seeing new energy in examining operations and technology. I think we can all take away from Kari's presentation that it's critical to carefully consider how your processes and tools impact your work. I like the quote Kari put out there: "Tech is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral." Without being thoughtful in the design and the use of technology, we can unintentionally create big barriers and burdens for our grantees. So, what can your organization do to be aware of and reduce this burden? As a funder, it's comforting and inspiring to know that small changes can have big impacts for your applicants. Grant Advisor makes this easy to get started with the Fix the Form checklist. We'll make sure to add a link in the chat. Like Kari said, if funders like yourself can make some small changes, it could be transformative for applicants. Now, let's listen to my colleague Sammy talk about how to use technology to address specific pain points Kari's team learned about in their survey of grant seekers.
I think this is a great segue from some of Kari's questions that she just answered. So using technology as a benefit and not a barrier. With technology, you can create a benefit to your grantees. I think we've all talked about that, right? It's an online form they can come back to, they can save, they can see their history with you as a funder. But how can we use the solution in a meaningful way? And so I actually want to talk about two examples here that are on Kari's list, those surprise pop-up questions and the character counts. And so what we're seeing on the screen is actually a screenshot from yesterday of our client success managers going through Fix the Form training with Kari. At Foundant, one of the things that we love to offer is the technology, right? Here is the solution. But the other component of that is the best practice and the community around the forms and the way we use technology. And so two of those kind of best practices that I want to talk about that we're thinking about at Foundant are one around those surprise logic questions. As a funder, you're probably thinking, I'm helping my grantees. I'm creating this logic so they only have to fill out the information that's pertinent to them. I'm making it so they don't have to read through and kind of decide, do I need to answer that? Do I not need to answer that? Potentially having a ton of optional questions, right? That then requires you to go back to the grantee, all of those different things. From the product side, can see total value in those logic questions, right? Those surprise pop-up questions. But how can we use those in an effective manner so that we don't create the pain point on our grantees? And this is where, as we continue to think about those, it's creating good instructions, right? If we're going to have a question that is going to create surprise pop-up questions, let's put that in the instruction area, something like program area. Based on how you respond to this question, you will receive additional follow-up questions, or you may not. When we look at something like the PDF export that does come out of the system, right, that's automatically, we can say question list out of GLM, that contains everything. If you have something hidden behind a question branch, it's going to show in that question list. So as you build, right, and use technology to help us understand those tools, we want to put in good and clear instructions. Now, people may not always read those instructions, but it's going to start to move that ball left, right? Let's make sure we know questions that are going to contain these pop-up questions indicate that. And let's make sure in those Word or PDF views that our clients, our grantees have access to in advance, we're clear in there. This question will only need to be answered if you answered Y above. So again, it's using that technology with some best practices kind of together. The next one I wanted to talk about, and Kari already mentioned it, is that character and word count, right? In the solutions, we see things like character or word counts that need to be implemented from kind of a database structure, right? We can't hold, 20,000 characters in a cell that then becomes reportable. But as Kari said, let's use instructions. Let's say we've added the max character amount to this question to give you space to answer as needed. And then one of my favorite client examples, and Kari touched on this to kind of say it's a paragraph or 2 paragraphs. Let's call out how we're going to use the information. And I think this goes into some of that technical time wasters as well. If we're telling our grantees or our applicants specifically why we need the information, it's going to help them tailor how they're providing it, why they're providing it to you. And Brian, to your question, if we can't say why we need the information or we know we're not looking at it, that might start to be a gauge into this might be a technical time waster. If I can't indicate to why my grantees and how we're going to use this, it might maybe need to move to internal or be something that we take out of our application altogether. I do think that's another component. And I think Tracy might touch on this, is moving some of that due diligence or technical response answers internally as well, and taking that off of our grantees is another way to continue to use the technology and the tools we have available for things like reporting and analytics, but streamlining our applications. Tammy, if you want to go to the next slide. I would be remiss if I talked about, streamlining and creating forms, and I didn't highlight some of my favorite features that are available in GLM. So we did have that question come up earlier. Can I go to PDF or to Word? Our print packets do come out in PDF as they exist today, but you have access to that. You have access to that question list. A couple other things I would hope all of our clients are aware of is we have access to create a public apply page. This is a way to create a link that looks exactly like your apply page that your applicants can get to without having to create that login, without having to set up a password. It'll allow, kind of to Kari's point, it gives them that ability to see what is the criteria. They can preview the application in the online system. They can get access to the question list without those initial barriers of having to create an account. It'll allow them to see how the form's going to interact, hopefully eliminating some of those surprise pop-up questions as well. And so I really would encourage, if you're a Foundant user, to consider implementing that public apply page to kind of give this transparency to your grantees as well. Another one of my favorite features, and Tracy called this one out, and I'm going to kick it to her in just a second, is our collaborator functionality. We do hear time and time again that our grantees are working in Word, and that's a really easy way for them to cut and paste and have multiple people work on one application. But the collaborator functionality starts to move that into the software. Again, for some of our grantees, this might be a great fit. It's a way that they can have multiple people working in the online system all at once. And so really kind of moving that, so it's not one key person. We know this is kind of a group effort from our grantees. And then other kind of features that I think are really great in the Foundant solution are the autosave functionality, which hopefully all of you are aware of, and that ability for our applicants to come back and save and work on it later, right? That ability to say, I don't have to do all of this at once, which is a really big time saver for them. Maybe they need to go get additional information, or they're managing so many different things. We're going to have that ability. And then one last thing, that little teaser we're going to be working on is a new rich text response. And that really is in feedback from some of the work that Kari did and talking to her, to really allow that streamlining process of copy and paste. So that if we have formatting that existed in a grantee's Word document, they can just copy and paste that right into the system, and it'll be able to hold some of that rich text, and they're not going to have to go back in and implement hyphens instead of bullets, which we don't have. Really not only streamlining the application process by thinking about the questions that we ask, but how those responses get into the system as well.
Since hearing Kari and Sammy speak on this topic, I've thought about our branching and our logic functionality here at Foundant in such a different way. From a grants manager and technologist perspective, it's an awesome tool to streamline applications, but I know I had never really considered how not seeing all the application questions up front could negatively impact an applicant. This is a great example of why it's important to seek feedback from a variety of perspectives when using a new tool. Some small changes to how we use the tool in this case can go a long way to assist all users. As someone who trains users on Foundant software, it's critical for myself and my teammates to be tuned into best practices like these. That's why our Client Success Manager team went through Fix the Form training with Kari. We then followed up with fixing our own example forms that we share with all new Grant Lifecycle Manager clients. We implemented the best practices Sammy spoke about, including indicating in the instructions the presence of branching questions throughout our example application to eliminate surprises for applicants. We also demonstrate explaining why you need certain information. I really like this one. It's a great self-check on if you really need and use all the information you collect. Now, I'm excited to turn it over to Tracy from the Poise Foundation, who will talk about what it looked like for her organization to implement changes to their forms and grant-making process.
My name is Tracy Johnson. I am the program officer at Poise. And just to tell you a little bit about the Poise Foundation, we are a Black-led, Black-serving community foundation that is located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We often, promote assisting the Black community in achieving self-sustaining practices. And we do this in two ways. I want to address this through our collective giving, making philanthropy accessible to the Black community. And so we don't have these high dollar donor amounts to create a fund. Actually, you only need $1,000 to create a fund in order to, start working toward your philanthropic interests. And we also do this through our grant making. And so as a community foundation, we are made up of a variety of different types of funds. Some of them are unrestricted and some of them are donor advised for very specific charitable purposes, whether it is education or entrepreneurial activities or toward activities that are focused on young ladies. Those funds are available in our grant making process. We also provide scholarships. We do pre-K through post-secondary scholarships. Our pre-K through 12th grade scholarships are generally focused in the Allegheny County area, but our post-secondary scholarships are focused for all across the country. And generally, our grant-making footprint is within the Pittsburgh region. And so now I'll talk a little bit about our grant making. And so because we are focused in the Pittsburgh region, we are very much committed to funding Black-led, Black-serving organizations in the Pittsburgh community. And so we do offer general operating and program support when it comes to our grant making, but we tend to really zero in on those Black-led organizations because we do lend to the data that shows that those organizations are not necessarily funded at the same level as their white counterparts. And so we take pride in really investing in those organizations. And our founder, Mr. Bernard Jones, this was his mindset, this was his vision to develop a foundation that was able to sow back into the Black community and back into Black organizations that serve those communities. So as you can see, we were founded in 1980, and we are definitely in the midst of celebrating our 40th anniversary, even in the midst of a pandemic. So it's really pretty cool. So now I'll talk a little bit about a profile of our grantees. So when we think about the grantee organizations that we typically fund, those organizations typically tend to be budgets of $600,000 or less. They tend to have the majority are unpaid staff members. And what does that actually mean? That means that you have an executive director who is running one of these small to medium-sized Black-led, Black-serving organizations, and they're not even paying themselves a salary. They have a passion for what is going on in the community. They have a passion to make change, and they have surrounded themselves with some consistent volunteers that help enable them to foster that change in their community. And so knowing this about our grantees and about our applicants who typically comes to us for funding, a lot of our applicants that come to us are organizations that have never written a grant. They don't know anything about grant writing. They just want to serve the community. And they have already been out investing their own funds into making change. And so when they come to us, it's a new experience. And a lot of these organizations, we are very much the first grant that they receive from any foundation in our region. And so we pride ourselves in taking that investment into these organizations. It's interesting because I kind of like to say that we are a risk taker because we will invest in those small startups. We will invest in those who have a dream of making a difference. So that is just who we are as a foundation. And so that brings us to 2020, which was a really unique year for all of us. And 2020 can definitely be coined as the year of multiple pandemics. With COVID-19 and the shutdowns that happened nationwide, and then with the murder of George Floyd and all of the protests that happened day after day, it was definitely a time of individuals trying to navigate all of this change, good, bad, or indifferent, that was happening within our communities. And one of the things that we found as a foundation is that our Black-led organizations were very much being adversely impacted by these multiple pandemics that were happening. And not only were our Black-led organizations being adversely impacted, so were our Black families and communities. And so when Pennsylvania issued its first shutdown, everyone thought maybe this will be like 2 weeks, maybe it'll be 3 weeks, but this turned out really to be months long. And so for any organization trying to survive being shut down for months, this definitely impacted our organization's ability to raise money. It impacted our organization's ability to be able to meet face to face with the individuals they serve. But what we also saw was that these organizations pivoted what they were normally doing to really become frontline support for those in the community that had needs. And so as a lot of individuals in the Black community within the Pittsburgh region were laid off of jobs, found themselves unemployed, these organizations really stepped up to the forefront to provide rental assistance, to provide utility assistance. They were, on the front lines, making sure that, students who were doing virtual learning had the tools necessary to do that. So they were delivering laptops. They were delivering cooked meals to seniors in high rises. They were delivering medications. And so we saw this shift taking place. And so it made us begin to think as a foundation, how can we support these organizations and how can we really think about getting resources on the ground quickly? And so that led to a transformation in our thinking in regards to how can we make change through our grant making. And so this change initially started with our Critical Community Needs Fund. And so with the Critical Community Needs Fund, we were very intent and focused on serving Black-led, Black-serving organizations that had budgets of $600,000 or less, and that had 10 or less paid staff people. So we were very focused on what that criteria looks like, but then we began to think, what does this application process look like? It can't look like what we normally do because we are not in normal times. And so we began to have these internal conversations, which led me to say, hey, let's start to talk to the community about this. Let's talk to our grantees, our current grantees, former grantees. Let's talk to applicants that maybe we have never funded in the past. Let's talk to community members and really try to understand what we can do to alleviate burden and get resources on the streets. And so we did a series of focus groups, we did some surveys, we did some one-on-one conversations, and some interesting things began to pop out when we did this. So one of the first things that kind of popped out was that, a long application is going to be a barrier to service. So if we have all of these 501 questions that we as a foundation like to ask, and we want to know every little bit of information, then that is going to be a barrier to these individuals who are on the ground meeting emergencies, that are on the ground dealing with crises. And so we had to think about that. And then we had to think in terms of these organizations have limited capacity to sit down and spend spend several hours on an application, uploading a variety of budget forms. Yes, those things are important, but right now, what's important is making sure that food, medications, mental health services get out into our communities. And so the other thing that really popped out that we started to learn about is that there were churches out there on the front lines meeting needs of those in the community. And a lot of times foundations don't typically have a focus around funding churches. And so we actually shifted that mindset to say, hey, if you are providing social services in the community, if you are providing food, if you are providing clothing, if you are, offering, tablets and laptops, these are things we definitely need to invest in, because in Black communities, a lot of times churches are the first and only nonprofit. People go to the churches and the mosques when they need help and they need support. And so taking all of this in mind, we really started to think through what type of application process can we have and how can we do this in a virtual COVID-19 pandemic space that makes sense and expedites requests. So one of the first things that we did was we simplified our application. So we did away with the budget requests. We did away with audited financials and profit and loss statements. We did away with those pieces and made it really simple. And we positioned the application so that the organizations that were applying could put their presentation and their request from a position of strength and not a position of deficit. We wanted to showcase and highlight through the application process that these organizations are really focused on bringing change, and they're focused on mitigating the impact of COVID-19 in Black communities here in our region. And so we simplified the application, making it short and sweet. We had a couple of narrative questions, but we had a lot of like, hey, click and check the box to make it really simple. Instead of you trying to draft like several narratives, here's like, a few short answer questions. Instead of having to upload a budget, we said, hey, just give us a brief, let us know what you're going to do with the funds. And that really, for us as a foundation, allowed us to walk in the spirit of a trust-based philanthropy approach. And so instead of like operating in traditional philanthropy, we stepped out of that and said, hey, we really want to be a partner with you to make difference and to support the community during these times of crisis. All of our grants for CCNF were general operating grants, meaning that they were unrestricted. So we did not hold organizations by the throat and say, hey, you better meet what you outlined here. We did it with the intention of, we know that this is a pandemic. We know that this is a crisis. We expect that there will be shifts. There will be changes. You may need to use the funds differently. There may be a different need that comes up. So we were definitely prepared for that. We went from making a decision in our regular grant making for 5 months into doing weekly decisions. And so we engaged our distribution committee and they were amazing. We met every Friday and we made decisions. And so if you got your application in the Friday before, by the next Friday, you had a decision. You knew whether or not you were funded. So we took like the mystery out of whether or not you were funded. We just really began to like operate in, let's make these decisions quick so they know. And then if they weren't funded for some reason, we were definitely open for feedback to say, okay, well, this is why you weren't funded. So we really need you to think about this framework. And so we served as that thought partner with organizations, and some of them were able to come back and reapply and receive funding. And so we wanted to make quick work of this. The grant agreements, we did that electronically through Foundit. So that was super quick. So we weren't waiting, organizations, some of them were like, did you mail us a grant agreement? Did you email it to us? And I said, hey, no, it's right on your dashboard. Here is where you find it. And so they were able to complete their grant agreement right there online. We have it. Their ACH information, that was another thing that we changed and shifted in our work process. Instead of doing checks, we moved to an electronic payment, but we knew we needed to collect ACH information. And so we did that through Fondant, but we did delete, like as soon as we got that information, recorded it, we deleted it to get rid of it. So it's not sitting there, but it just made it easy for our organizations to be able to submit their organization and for us to get those payments out timely. And so instead of them waiting for a couple weeks for a check, or even the way the mail was acting at that time, and even currently acting now, instead of waiting, it was like, hey, like you're able to get a payment in a few days. And so we were able to like do these little things that changed the way that we worked internally, and we took the burden of the work as a foundation. And what we wanted to do was really free up our organizations to do what they do best, which was work in the community. And so just a couple things from our application that really helped to kind of streamline the process. We really try to make it simple. So in thinking about, tell us about your organization. So like, we're very much mindful of like those character limits and all of that. And, and as, someone who has taken database management, I know you have to like put a limit to everything, but we give enough space in our characters so that organizations can share as much as they want or as little as they want. We definitely fund organizations that have fiscal sponsors. And so like organizations are able, like, we allow those organizations to apply. We don't put the onus on the fiscal sponsor applying. We say, hey, organization, you can apply, just make sure like you send us a copy of your fiscal sponsor agreement that's current. But we make it simple because like a lot of times foundations will say, nope, only the fiscal sponsor can apply, but we allow the fiscally sponsored organization to apply. So we made these like simple changes. And as you can see, like the type of organization, you could just click on it. You didn't have to type that in or anything. Next one is we definitely use an eligibility form. We use that eligibility form and criteria because we didn't want organizations applying for this fund or any of our grants for that fact to just not be a good fit or not know what the criteria is or not fitting the criteria, but you've gone through the whole process and now you don't, you're really ineligible somewhere. So we use this eligibility form to really think through like, what are the few things that we need to know to get organizations access to our grant application? And so we were very focused about it. So we knew that like, within the Pittsburgh region, there were a lot of counties that needed support, but we focused on Allegheny and Beaver County. And so like, if you were doing work in Westmoreland, that did not make you eligible to apply for critical community needs. So we really tried to make everything specific so that instead of you going on this long journey of doing the application and getting a denial because you don't fit like any of the initial criteria, we eliminated that with the use of the eligibility form. Really trying to use our application process to allow organizations to really shine forth from a position of strength and not a position of weakness, no matter where they are on the scale, whether they have paid staff or not, whether they are brand new or like have been around for 100 years. We try to pretty much level the playing field for everyone who comes seeking a grant from Poise.
It's so helpful and inspiring to hear Tracy share real-world examples with proven results. She provides so many great ideas, but a few stood out to me. Fix the Forms checklist is a great place to start, but nothing can replace talking to your own community. I love that Poise sought feedback from not only grantees, former and future, but also community members and folks they had never funded before. Something else that stood out to me was how clear Poise was on their funding intentions and goals. And then they communicated them proactively, including an eligibility quiz, to not waste applicants' time. Last but not least, I like how Poise really took this work far beyond their application and it streamlined the entire funding process, including shortening the decision timeline, as well as moving grant agreements and payments online. To wrap up, I want to thank you all for joining us today. As we begin to return to life that looks a bit more like before the COVID-19 pandemic, it's important to consider what changes and learnings from the last year plus we want to embrace and keep with us. Even if your organization has little to no staff, there are small changes you can make to have a big impact. Get started today by looking at Grant Advisor's Fix the Form checklist to review your own forms and find opportunities to make them more accessible and less burdensome to a wider range of grant seekers, helping your grant seekers and you maximize your organization's impact and the impact of the philanthropic community as a whole. Thank you so much for all that you do. We appreciate your time with us today.